This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Hello, good evening, viewers, and again, we want to wish you a pleasant Sunday evening, and welcome to African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy to 50 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of African Guyanese communities through education and the empowerment of self-activity. I am Royston sitting in for Elsie Harry, and I will be your host on this evening's program. The recent killing of political activist Courtney Cromwell has brought into spotlight once again, the issues of violence in our political process. From the events of the 1960s to Walter Rodney and now this latest killing, Guyana had to confront the issue of political violence in our and our politicians, all of them, have always condemned and denied such violence, yet it is a reality in our political landscape. What are the consequences of the violence for the quest of a joint nationhood, for the democratic process, and for most critically, mass participation in politics? These and others related questions will form the base of today's program. Violence and the political process. That's our show this evening. And we have none other but than Mr. Nigel Hughes, attorney at law, political activist, and politician. Mr. Christopher Ram, attorney at law, chartered accountant, political activist, commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to the program this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right. Let me just define. Well, let me probably ask you to define for us or for the audience what you understand by political violence in your own words.
You want to go first, Nigel?
No, not at all.
Well,
Not at all.
it's in this. I think it's important to bear in mind that whenever we're defining any word or term, you're talking both about the text as well as the context that is happening. In the particular context in which we are here this evening, the killing of Courtney Cromwell on the evening of March 10th, it's really the use of violence to achieve a political end, whether it's to neutralize an opponent, to bring fear into the population, or to pursue a political agenda. And that would be the context in which I would consider it relevant for this evening's discussion.
All right, thank you.
No, I mean, I agree, Chris. Political violence is what it says. It's violence that has a political objective. There's one possible consideration that I think could be added to Chris's context when we were discussing Courtney Cromwell, and that is that the death of Mr. Cromwell could also have been intended to be a provocative act, intending to provoke a particular reaction from a certain part of the community, and that's perhaps, I mean, if as we discuss this, for me, that's perhaps where I would locate the death of Mr. Cromwell.
Oh, very good, thanks.
I share that.
You share that as well. But I heard in both responses a sense that we're almost saying, I hope I'm correct in this, that the political violence has now become a part of our political process? Is that what we're seeing as such?
I would say it has become. Violence has been in Guyana's politics for a long, long time. I don't think it has ever left. I wasn't here in the 60s, but certainly from the stories that the elders tell, it was an awful time, and that was political violence. We've come through the 70s. You had, if you go through the era from when Dr. Rodney surfaced, I was in school, you certainly had a lot of deaths that were politically related, culminating in his death on the 13th of June 1980. And coming all the way through, there's always been violence associated with politics, whether we were burning cane fields, whether we were actually physically harming people. It's been there, so I don't think it's a recent phenomenon. And of course, when you come to the crime wave, you have, what, 400 plus young men murdered, executed, some of them executed, going all the way back to, what's the name of that young man that the special squad took out in Buxton that started this whole thing? His name will come back just now, but I mean, that started I would call that was a massacre. Yeah, 400 people in whatever period of time. We've seen people who couldn't drive down the East Coast highway shot, killed, left in their cars. Violence has been very closely related to politics in Ghana. We're not at the level of Jamaica, where you could lose 900 men in 1 year, 900 people, sorry, in 1 year as a result of politics. But we certainly, it's a close companion.
You know, whether it's 200, 400, as we had in the early part of the century, or one as we've just had, it's bad. And what makes it particularly worse, if it's done by the state, or agents of the state, or agents of political actors in the political landscape, those to me make it much worse than the ordinary kind of violence. And I'm not trying to downplay the type of violence we have, domestic violence and the violence we see all the time. It seems and whether this has come about because of the kind of society, the slavery, the plantation structures, the social structures we've had, whether we've always felt that violence is part of the way to bring about discipline in a society, and then it's misused for all kinds of purposes.
Well, I just, and I'm only, this is purely for academic purposes. Chris's point, dealing with violence and the history and coming through from slavery, you can pick a country like Barbados, which has very little political, almost non-existent political violence, that has a long history of slavery. And on the other hand, you can pick a country like Trinidad, which has a relatively short history of slavery. Trinidad didn't have, I think, less than 100 years of slavery, but it has got some real serious political violence. It's got some serious violence, period. So I'm not quite sure what it is. I think in Barbados, of course, I suppose one would argue it's a much smaller community. It's almost a homogeneous community, and therefore, you know, there's a reduction in the level of violence. In Jamaica, on the other hand, when the politicians
which is also fairly homogeneous.
Yeah, true. The politicians went to bed with the criminals in the 1970s, and the criminals took advantage of that, and now they run the politics, as you can see. So I'm not sure. And in Guyana's case, I don't think we are particularly violent. I think what we have a history of is of governments being violent to the people, and the people not responding. But I'm not sure that we are particularly. There's a lot of violence in Guyana without the people necessarily being violent. I mean, that sounds like a contradiction in terms, because domestic violence has reached unacceptable levels. But I don't think it's the people necessarily compared to Jamaica or other places that we necessarily more violent. We certainly have a high incidence of violence though.
But even in the discussion just now, we attempted to, well, in a sense, we would have showed some relevance to what are some of the signals of origin of this kind of an activity. And when you referred to the Barbados scenario, I remember reading through a few pages of history some months ago that signaled that the situation in Barbados compared with Guyana would have been somewhat different, because perhaps they had no
Were they homogeneous?
No. I mean, okay, there was no process of I don't remember exactly what they called it.
But they've evolved in some ways in the same way that we've all been slave. We've had our roots in slavery,
right?
Colonialism, and the pre-independence struggle. And I wonder if it has something, in fact, to do with the independence struggle and what tools might have been employed at any particular point in time, generally.
Here's what happens in Guyana. Barbados, for example, has changed governments, and politics is not a do or die situation. In Guyana, because of our political history, which is closely tied to race, which is closely tied to power, you either had to have power or you were the wrong end of the scale. We've changed governments once in 50 years. Once, 1992. That's the only time we've changed government. So in Guyana, politics and power are almost life and death scenarios. And with this constitution that we have, which vests all the executive power, even if you get less than 50% in one party, it means that people will do whatever they can to get power. So part of the problem also, it didn't happen this way at colonialism, but when we got this new constitution, it says, look, all the power is going to be vested in whoever wins the presidency, who gets the entire executive. It becomes critical. Your politics, unlike Barbados, where you can change governments, you can vote them down. They've changed governments since independence. Barbados has probably changed government, I don't know, 7, 8 times. Guyana, we changed it once, and therefore it's critical. I mean, that's just a sort of general comment.
I want to add, Nigel talked about race and power. I agree. But the power is the control it gives over resources.
Yeah.
And now, when you think of how resources have been diverted from the state and the people to a few politicians, I mean, now you have Jack Deo, former president, praising greed, praising avarice, defending corruption. So, and you know what has happened, and I think it's not irrelevant to the death of Courtney Crummy Wing, is that, look, there is so much at stake in elections. In Barbados, you don't have, you have institutions that function. You wouldn't have somebody, you wouldn't have a situation where the Auditor General is unqualified, or the Director of Public Prosecution is handpicked, or you've got the people at the top of the judiciary in acting positions for close to 10 years, Nigel.
Probably more than 10 years.
Those, you have institutions in this country. You don't have institutions. You have so-called institutions. I mean, when you have the wife of the finance minister, who is supposed to be in the audit office to see that things go well, taking money probably from a slush fund to take first-class airfares to go and use for personal medical purposes, you want that to continue. And now, if you want that to continue, you're prepared. I'm not saying this has happened in this case, but there's a great temptation. With all of this at stake, and possibly, and I've heard people talking about bringing people to book in the courts and possibly jailed, people are fighting for their survival now. And if it means that you have to have a few casualties along the way, perhaps so be it.
But
it is frightening. Yeah. It is frightening, and I'm not defending it.
Right.
But this is why the point that Nigel was talking about, this attempt to perhaps goad people into retaliation, as David Hines referred to it, as a tit for tat. I think, and here is where I believe it's fortuitous. Nigel used Ramjatan. None of them knew that the coalition would have been so important at this stage. Because had there not been the coalition, Nigel, things might have turned out very, very differently.
Yes, absolutely. I have to agree with you in that way, Chris. I think the coalition has probably focused the mind of the government like nothing else has. In a three-way race, I figure from where they stand or sit, they thought they had it covered. A coalition where all the political parties are lined up against the PPP. I mean, well, let me say all the major political parties. You've got the People's National Congress, the Working People's Alliance, GAP, all the parties that Justice for All, all the Alliance for Change are all, despite whatever differences they may have, lined up against the government, and all of them are saying as a priority that this administration cannot continue the way it is. Not because of who they are, but because of what they have done to the Constitution, what they have done to everything in the society. The fabric of society is falling apart.
Is it fair to suggest, I mean, in this instance, who perhaps stands chance of benefiting and who stands to suffer in this kind of a political
You mean in terms of the
violence? Yeah.
Well, I prefer to give both sides of the argument, and the government has argued, if you listen to President Ramatara has argued that the PPP has nothing to gain by this murder. I call it an assassination, because it's going to put them in a bad light. I suppose you could take that with doses of salt if you wish. And the other side of the coin is that Courtney Cromwell, the individual, did not have a sufficiently large political following. He was, a matter of fact, he was not a member of any party. This was a citizen who was protesting a single issue. And at the time he died, he was saying to people, go out and vote. He supported the opposition, but he was not a politician. So he didn't have a stake in this. He didn't want to get elected. He wasn't on a list. He wasn't likely to be on the list.
Right.
Okay. When Mr. Cromwell is killed, it sends shockwaves through the society. Forget the shock, the manner in which he was killed and how he was killed. Any young person, particularly a young person who might have traditionally have come from the PPP support base, who thought that things had reached a stage where enough is enough, and they were thinking of coming out, let's say, on Facebook, not even, let's say, in public. They were going to come out on Facebook and put up a post that said, it's time for transparency. When they look at what happened to Mr. Cromwell, any thoughts they had, remotely, of even coming out on Facebook are extinguished. They're not coming out. And this is long before you get to the rest of the message, the rest of that message. So it starts from as gentle a level as that, all the way across the board to party activists who are going down the street now, who have to be afraid or have some fear that their safety is in danger. So that message it resonates at several levels. It's look, if you think you're going to be able to come out and do something, you can't. The other issue is this: because Mr. Cromwell was so prominent, because he stood outside of the Attorney General's chambers for 100 days, I think it was, on a point of principle. When you take him down as a young person who had served the country, who was a national athlete, who went to the principal school in the country, and this is not, I didn't go to QC, but I mean, this is your primary educational institution, secondary institution in the country. This guy's a graduate of the school. He was a national athlete. He served the country in the armed forces. You really can't get better than that.
Yeah.
So symbolically what he represented was second to none. And you take him down in the prime of his life with 3 daughters. The community from which he comes from is going to say, we can't accept this. This is unacceptable behavior. And because people don't have confidence in the judicial process, and long before you get to the judicial process, because people don't have any confidence in the Guyana police force, and the recent survey just said that of all the Latin American countries, I think Guyana police force enjoys the least level of confidence amongst its citizenry. they know that the chances of anybody being brought to justice or to court, and more importantly, a conviction being secured, are close to none. So it is likely to provoke the strongest of emotional responses in people who think that this was an execution, and this was an execution that happened in circumstances which were clearly political. Let me just give you a simple example, not an example, one simple item that would have changed this whole scenario. If there was no bullhorn found at that scene, the state could have spun the story that Mr. Crummy Wing was on a dark street at the back of Diamond doing some sort of illegal transaction, and he got shot and killed.
And they would probably put a gun next to him.
They would also have done that, but even if they didn't have that, it would easily have been accepted by us, or a lot of people, that look, hey, was he doing at the back of Diamond at 8 o'clock in the night, couple of empty house lots there, very easy. So it perhaps is the negligence of his executioners or their enthusiasm to execute him that they overlooked that. But maybe because they wanted to send a political message, they left the bullhorn there. But it is as easy as that. So think of how many other people that we have read about stories where they've been executed, etc., etc. But to come back to the point, that provokes at every level in the community from which Mr. Crummy Wing comes from anger, without a doubt. And once you provoke anger, people behave the way angry people behave. And that's why the call has been for absolute calm. We are aware how outraged people are. We are aware how angry people are. We are aware of people restraining themselves. But because of the time, as the Roman Catholic statement said, the bishop said, the curious timing of this execution and what a reaction may do to national events on May the 11th, everybody is going to have to stand up.
Let's take President Ramatar as his word. The PPP didn't have anything to gain out of it. Did the opposition, for whom Mr. Crummy Wing was going about there saying, come out and vote for the opposition, they had even less of a motive?
No, the government's argument is, look, if the opposition kill him, it would make the government look bad. So the opposition will look better. So that is
as implausible as it is. As implausible as it is.
Argument.
Let's put, and I started by saying sometimes you have to take things in context. 2 days earlier, who was talking violence? Who was preaching violence? Who was asking for the kicking of asses?
Babu John.
Just 2 days earlier, in a race-filled speech. There's no getting away from it. In as much as they're trying to resile, oh, he didn't say this, and he didn't say PPP is a Kuli party, even Rohi said he didn't say that. Now, nobody apparently said anything. They might even say Crummy Wing is not dead. So absurd are they in having to confront what has now been an outrage and a reaction, or they may say it's a non-reaction, but it is a reaction that persons, the people, David Hines, Nigel Hughes, and the AFC, the APNU, have said, look, let us not go down the road of the bullet. Let's go via the ballot. A couple letters make a big difference. And that's what they have done. And that is the surprise, that is the big surprise in all of this. The reaction is, look, let us have a measured response to this. Let us call for a proper, full investigation that is independent and professionally done. We're not hearing much. You know, something like this, you probably would expect some bulletins to be coming out. Instead, what kind of bulletin you get? And I don't distinguish for purposes like these. And you know, with our past, you don't necessarily separate the police from the army, from the government itself. What is the police doing? What are the police doing in calling on David Hines, who said, please don't let us have tit for tat, and warning him for saying something like that? I mean, they can't be serious. And the crime chief could find David Hines in Arizona, but they don't seem able to find anything here.
Right here.
So I would think if you take all the facts and circumstances into consideration and the denial and rationale that the PPP and the spokespersons are offering, it still points fairly conclusively towards them.
Yeah.
Chris, of course, is a lot more bold than I am on this because
on this occasion.
No. I don't know. That's it. Well, forthright, I should say. For me, you don't need to go beyond the facts. You don't need to go beyond this Courtney Cromwell's death. You don't need to go beyond the facts. This guy was outside the Attorney General's chambers for 100 days. The Attorney General, there are two high-ranking government persons who threatened him. He makes a report to Brickdown Police Station about it. While he's outside the Attorney General's chambers, he gets charged with disturbing the peace at the behest of a particular minister. He then starts the campaign for people to go and vote. Forget whether he says voting for the opposition. People to go and vote, and he says vote for the opposition. He's walking down the road with his bullhorn saying go and vote. And he's executed doing that. Courtney Cromwell wasn't executed as he was turning into his bridge late one night and two marked men came up and took him out. He was executed in the midst of doing political work. You tell me, is that some accident?
Or perhaps civic work.
Civic work. Is that an accident? Is that a robbery gone wrong? What is it? It's as if you shoot a politician standing on the podium and then say, please don't brand this as a political killing. I mean, unless we're in Alice in Wonderland, I'm not sure what we're missing here. What else is this? His wallet is on him, his cell phone is on him, and the bullhorn is 2.5 to 3 feet away from him. That's how he's executed. No, better than that, nobody in a robbery takes the time to shoot you from behind 5 times. They shoot you to take you down if you show resistance, or they shoot you and they get what they want and they go. This is 3 bullets to the head from behind. One from the back of the neck. One on the left shoulder, one on the other side. That is not a robbery. People don't shoot you behind your head in a robbery. To start with, they're confronting you, so they will shoot you from the front. And if you're running away, they shoot you once and you fall and they go and pick up your whatever it is. So this is an execution. And it's an execution while he was doing what? Political work. So help me here. What is this if it is not a political assassination?
Well, I wonder.
I could only assume that because you say it's political, people start getting worried. But the fact is, if you get shot doing political work, it's a political assassination. I don't see the magic or the difficulty in saying it's a political assassination. People saying it's an ill-tempered statement. If you get killed doing political work or executed doing political work, I don't know. Is it a home invasion? Is it a robbery? What is it?
Yeah, it's pretty obvious. But I wondered, how do we see this kind of an event impeding our quest for racial unity?
Well, I would immediately jump in and say, look, there's nothing to indicate what the identity of the assailants were.
Right.
So I wouldn't want us to go down the road of starting to speculate on that. We know who may benefit from it, but there's nothing to indicate what the identity of the assailants were. I think more important is not the identity of the assailants; it's the authors of this, because this was not. If it was 2 guys who decided they were going to take Courtney down because they wanted to steal something from him, that's fine. But this is clearly a hit. A hit has a purpose. Somebody's got to pay for a hit. Somebody's got to order a hit. It doesn't happen. Marks people and hired hitmen don't kill you on their own. They kill you for gain, or they kill you for a purpose. So it's the authorship of this execution that one has to look look at.
And bear in mind, the president himself, he talked about the intellectual authors
Yes.
of the execution.
Yes, yeah.
So
yeah.
at that point, and given that the president probably has more information than anyone else, because he can call up anybody,
Right, yeah.
he must have known what he was talking about.
When we look at this whole situation, how has political violence, I mean, we would have talked about it roundabout, but how has political violence affected democracy in Guyana, really?
You gotta ask Chris that. Chris was here a victim of WPA. When the WPA was the favorite target of the government, Chris was around. I'm sure he could tell you about.
I must make an admission as well, Nigel. You talk about elders who were there in the 60s. I was born in 1946. So
Wow. Okay.
Look.
You're not part of the voting 35%.
No, not at all. The fact is, this violence impedes progress. It impedes development. Violence hurts poor people most and more than anyone else. So it keeps back the people, it keeps back the country. Look, people don't migrate from a place where they're very happy, where they feel safe. One of the greatest challenges of Guyanese is to leave their homes and go out and feel that they could come back and find everything in place. And given the violence that now permeates our society, you have people in their 80s being shot and killed. I mean, it's almost
people in the 80s being raped. They got women
raped. Yes. It's something has gone wrong with our psyche, and even if the politicians, the people at the top, had not engineered and orchestrated and authored those things, they have not set the example. And Jack Dio is one of the biggest examples of that, of not setting an example. What he said is, look, cost down, abuse, violence. He presided over the worst period of violence in Guyana. And now he's being paraded as the man who opposes violence, he opposes racism. I mean, as Nigel was asking, Alice in Wonderland?
Is he being paraded, or is he parading himself? I heard President Jack Dio say that we must stamp out racism and stamp out violence. I think people forget, or perhaps don't recall, that it was the cabinet secretary and head of the presidential secretariat who, under oath, said, "Hey, half the population is qualified to run, to represent the country." So when you talk about racial issues, this is not a discussion. This is a statement on the oath during his presidency, made by the head of the presidential secretariat and the cabinet secretary while he was president, who says, look, significant part of this country not qualified to represent. Now, might have been a statement of truth from where they sat, but that is a statement. Now, I didn't hear anybody in his administration before Mr. Jagdeo, Dr. Jagdeo demitted office. I never heard anybody say that that was an inaccurate statement, or that statement was without basis. It was just left there. So when we start to talk about race in politics, you have a statement on the oath. You have a statement on the oath. You've got a body of evidence on the oath that has not been challenged by his administration. Forget Mr. Ramachari. He came afterwards, and he found some suitably qualified people. But nobody during this President Jack Deo's administration challenged that. Nobody expressed absolute horror at what Dr. Luncheon said. Nobody expressed outrage in the administration that Dr. Luncheon must have gone off on his own and made that statement. So when we come today and we start to say, you know, racism must die, etc., etc., the biggest indictment about policies that might have been considered prejudiced came from the voice of the cabinet secretary and head of the presidential secretariat under the person who is now shouting the loudest about racism. We mustn't let that escape, or every time he says that, think of what the people who were the victim of that statement feel. You've just discovered that there's a racial problem when the head of your administration said that a significant body of this population was not qualified. And then there was a whole host of other evidence that has been there on record. Right. So, you know, because I think what has happened is that I think Guyanese have moved away all across the board from this race politics and race stuff that has been so much part of their political lives that they've had enough. And therefore now it perhaps is fashionable to want to condemn it or appear to condemn it on the surface. But, you know, the beneficiaries of these policies are alive and kicking and doing well.
You know, and apart from what Nigel was talking about, that type of abuse and psychological abuse, but you have, when you deny people their rights, that's a form of violence. And the number of rights that Guyanese have been deprived of over the past 22 years, I mean, so many constitutional offices have not been filled, but one of the most fundamental ones.
Chris, Guyanese have been denied rights for a long time. It's not 22 years.
Yes.
As a citizen, I mean, now forget being a politician. John Doe, citizen John Doe, if he was born in 1950 and lived through everything from independence coming forward, they've been abused. Period. They have been abused. That's a fact. You can't change that. Irrespective of whether they're Indian, African, Chinese, or whatever, they have been abused. We have lost literally whole segments of the population. The Portuguese, who used to be merchant class, don't exist in Canada. I mean, so it's not 22 years. We've been this way for a long time.
That's very true. But what he was doing was trying to put it in some context. As Nigel said, look, in 1992, we thought here was the dawn of this new era. Suddenly this is to happen. And then we have even a flawed constitution. We deprived of the benefits and our rights under that constitution. Now, we are deprived of our rights to be consulted, or we're deprived of our rights to be heard. Now, that in fact, and it's, again, I think Nigel is right, we are not a particularly violent society. If we were, we would not have tolerated those things. But I believe, you see, we have such a great faith in the ballot box. We always felt, the next elections will solve the problem. We've always gone from Desmond Hoyt, Corbyn, everybody has taken that view. The next election will solve it. No, we as a people will have to solve it. But what I think, and because
you
of
really want to make that statement? We got faith in the ballot box? In Guyana?
Well, we've kept saying the next election, the next election.
No, we have faith in immigrant visas. We have faith in migration. We have faith in self-sponsorship. We have faith in living in New York. We have faith in living in Miami. We have faith in living in Toronto. That's where we've had faith. We haven't had faith in ballot boxes.
Well, but the politicians still go there, and I mean, we put a lot.
Politicians are politicians. Politicians want to get into power. That's what politicians do. So, I mean, they're going to sell you wherever they want. The reality is, Guyanese have not had faith in the ballot box. All of us march with our feet. We leave.
But I want to believe, however, that those who went, the 166,000 persons who voted for the APNU, for example, they honestly believed and they were led to believe. We think, at this stage, and I keep coming back to this historic agreement between the APNU and the AFC. I think it is a watershed moment. It is something that even the WP has fought for that. It lost lives for that. It didn't bring it about. The WPA had the, we were joking today, we had the best manifesto, we had the best thought out campaign, we had the people credit the WPA with all the intellectual capital and all of that. But what happened? You go to the elections and nothing. But I believe, I sincerely think, Nigel and I hope you share my view, that we have turned a corner. And with this commitment to constitutional change. Now, part of our problem, we have...
You always see the glass as half full. I come from that generation that sees it as half empty. I think the signing of the agreement was a good thing.
Yeah.
But May the 12th will tell us whether we've done it. May the 12th will tell us. I mean, we can all feel euphoric and all of that now, but I just want to put that in perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think I think when the WPA went into the APNU as opposed to the other parties that went in, it was a step towards that.
Right.
Don't diminish it because the WPA electorally was not strong, but that has always been the WPA position. So they have preceded the AFC in saying what we need is national unity. I mean, you're going all the way back to the 70s. I mean, as a kid when Rodney was around, but they have always advocated that. What has happened is they haven't had the electoral strength, so that's because the AFC has the electoral strength, I think greater prominence is given to it, but they've always been committed, and I said the WPA, not the other parties in APNU, W particularly. So when we get here, I think, yes, it's a good step, but the proof of the pudding is May 11th. Naturally, I believe we're going to have a change, but this is Guyana. I'm hopeful, but you know, we got to see what happens.
Does the reaction?
But I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
Sorry,
not at all, Nigel.
I just wanted to say that.
Does the reaction and the rejection of retaliation offer tremendous hope as to the direction?
No. Let me give you an example why you shouldn't put too much emphasis on this. When Dr. Rodney was killed on June the 13th, 1980, everybody thought that the country would erupt. And what was the message that came out from the principal victim, the WPA? I never forget it. It was don't mourn, organize.
Yeah.
So this call for peace is not new. The WPA, when they lost their principal leader, Dr. Walter Rodney, when they had what people refer to as a mass support for him across the race. Never tested the ballot box, because I have views on that. The WPA's response was, don't mourn, organize. So Guyana, I think this is not new. We don't. I mean, unfortunately, or fortunately, the leaders of progressive movements through the history of the country have always, post the 60s violence, said there is a different and better way to address this than violence. Absolutely. It was when we came to the crime wave, and there was no political party advocating the crime wave. But if you go back to the greatest challenge we had, when Rodney died, when one can say perhaps the country was best primed for a mass uprising, the leaders of the WPA said, stay calm, don't mourn, organize, because they believed in a mass uprising or a peaceful solution to that. So I don't think that we necessarily any more mature. I think what has happened is that our memories, because they're so short, we forget that. Because if you go back, you were there, Andai, Jocelyn, all those leaders, Ogunse. I mean, Ogunse is a remarkable person, and if you go back and talk to him about that, that was their position. So all that we're really doing now is we're following the blueprint that they left behind. That these problems are best solved by a reasoned approach, and in this case, we go to the ballot. We're not going to do anything other than go to the ballot.
Isn't it also a recognition from the younger people that, look, that didn't get us anywhere? Well, it got us into a hole.
What didn't get us anywhere?
Violence and retaliation.
Well, when has it ever? Which young people?
Well, the current people.
Chris, you're not being yourself tonight. Chris, you name me any demographic of young people today that have demonstrated any elevated level of political consciousness or involvement. today, right now.
Well, you're the politician.
No, I'm not the politician. No, I am a reluctant politician.
Yeah, no, I mean it in this way. You meet more of the young people than I do.
Well, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'm not going to argue that. But what I'm saying is that I don't think that the young people are that concerned. I think people are shocked. But I don't think that the level of consciousness now in the young generation is anywhere close to parallel what it was in the 1970s, late 70s and early 80s.
They're perhaps less political
Totally
conscious,
different focus.
Because you had people from Bishop's High School, from Queen's College, who were prepared to go in those days. But isn't there a realization that, look, the past is the past. Don't tell us about banning of goods anymore. We've heard that. Yeah. Don't tell us about rigged elections. We've heard that. We want the corner to be turned. Now, is it optimism? Well, it probably is. But I think there's a good measure. I've got young children now who are saying, look, this is a great country. But the kind of political culture, this repetition of the past, this daring people, well, you retaliate. And if you don't retaliate and you say don't retaliate, they say, well, that's a form of retaliation if you ask Mr. Whitaker. So it's that kind of optimism. And I haven't often been accused of being an optimist, Nigel. Thank you.
No, but you mentioned Mr. Whitaker, and I know you were advising David Hines. Imagine if an Iranian, right, in Tehran, writes a letter to the editor in the Stabrook saying tit for tat politics. And the crime chief in Ghana is going to call Tehran to tell the Iranian, we got a problem here. You're writing a bad letter here. It's ridiculous. Why are you calling somebody in Arizona because they wrote a letter to the editor, probably sent it by email? What are you doing? I mean, are we serious? You just have a citizen executed, and you're concerned about some man sitting in Arizona behind a keyboard?
You know, I represent the Working People's Alliance in the Commission of Inquiry, Water Rodney Commission of Inquiry. What we learned, and we're seeing some evidence of it, the special branch operates now with the same rules. I'm not saying that they necessarily do the same thing. They do operate with the same rules, and they refuse to say, for example, I asked a straight question, do you still have a file on me? And they wouldn't answer.
But Chris, to be fair to them, if you go to the Central Intelligence Agency and say, I'm a U.S. citizen, do you have a file on me? You don't really want them to answer you, do you?
Well, it was partly rhetorical, but they were working on the same rules. Now, we know they were part of the violence that was being perpetrated on Guyanese.
What, the special branch?
The special branch.
You mean the police?
Yes.
No, you're talking about the police force.
Or part of the special branch, part of the police force.
Yeah. The police force was part of the violence.
Yes.
Special branch gathered the information and fed it to another part of the police force that carried out that acted in the information. But I don't know if special branch per se themselves were involved. I mean, their business is to gather information. And they gather information even of the politicians who are in office. The question is whether the politicians have access to those files, and there are long stories about that.
Well, 7 files, for example, are missing. But the fact is, we are still working with the same rules from the 60s and the 70s and at least 1980. We are working on those rules in the year 2015. Now, if that helped to foster and foment violence against the citizenry. Now, bear in mind, we're talking here on this program, violence by the state against the citizens. People who are deprived, who've had their voices taken away. And in this case, silence.
But we don't have evidence that the state is involved in Mr. Cromwell's yet.
But, I mean, the pilots referred to, would we consider that an accident?
Which one?
Accident of well, or we saying
you're up the yellow brick road?
All right, let me structure it a little differently. There would have been evidence of violence long time in Guyana's history, but in the 1990s, 1992, there was an upsurge
of violence
of upsurge of police and other military personnel getting it. Well, military violence against the ordinary people, citizens of the country. Would you consider that an accident, or is it directly related to our politics?
Let me see how I can address this. The Ghana Police Force historically has always had a section that is specially equipped to deal with special citizens in their mind. Okay. So let's look at the pure criminal element. If there's a particularly skilled criminal out there in terms of his ability to use weapons, armed robberies, etc., there's always been a squad that is specially tasked to do that. Okay. During the 80s...
Is that the death squad you refer to?
Yeah, the squad that was called the Quick Reaction Group. It had a series of names.
Yeah.
The public referred to it as a death squad. And they had some people who they had instructions not to bring in.
Right.
I know that for a fact. When I started to practice, they had people who they're not going to arrest them. Okay. What started to happen was that squad, because they acquired special skills and at the same time acquired a certain level of impunity from the law, started to go after targets that were not classified quote-unquote criminal. Started going after political targets. And of course, in the process, lots of citizens got executed, and they were not afforded due process. Several people executed. And they got coverage. They had no accountability. They didn't have to account for what they were doing. With the change in the world, in those days, the world was bipolar. But of course, by the time Mr. Hyde came, there was a lot of focus on human rights, etc., etc. That squad had to change its
Focus.
Not its focus. It still kept its methods, but it had to change its operating procedures. They have always been executing people in difficult circumstances. Always, always, always. I mean, if you go back to Shaka Blair is the gentleman I'm talking about. Shaka Blair. Shaka Blair was executed, and that started that whole thing. That's a whole special squad. They're going to kick down the door in front of the mother of his children, and they execute him. And there are a series of persons who were executed by that squad, and none of them have ever had to account. As a matter of fact, the head of that squad himself was executed in circumstances that have never been determined. Not even the geographic location has been determined. So that special squad has always been in the police force, and the politicians have always taken advantage of it. Then what happened is we had that whole killing squad that came with the Phantom Gang, when we had the Minister of Home Affairs in the person of Mr. Gad Raj, and we had a commission of inquiry that found that, this was what was actually going on with the blessing of the state. I don't think any of that has changed. I certainly don't think any of that has changed. Now, the squad may change its routes, it may change its operations, but it has not changed. And until we demand civilian oversight of the Ghana Police Force, constitutionally protected civilian oversight, we're going to continue to have that problem. Because the police always feel beholden to the Minister of Home Affairs. Once they have to account to somebody other than their political head, we're going to see a lot of changes.
Let's do quickly a little recounting. I'm probably going to ask you, Nigel, because you would have been more directly involved in that. Ivan is it Shamroy Boye, Ron Somerset, and I think it's Ivan Lewis.
And Lewis.
What just recount for us that scenario that occurred there in London.
That was the worst form of one of the worst forms of police violence we've had. These were unarmed citizens on a bridge exercising their democratic right on the first day of protest, where they had actually given the police notice that we're going to have a protest today. So this wasn't a surprise operation, and they were gunned down unarmed, not threatening the police, unarmed. Even the Commission of Inquiry said that the circumstantial evidence was such that only the police could have shot and killed them, and therefore they made an award, inadequate as it was. So the finding was that that was the case.
Of course, Courtney Crumwing was also unarmed.
Yeah.
A single person. All he had was a bullhorn. Not even a crowd.
Isn't that the new weapon against the state? The bullhorn?
It's of considerable symbolic value, I think.
Oh, fun. Yeah, I agree. Fully.
But I mean, I heard Nigel consider that to be that's Courtney's killing. In your opinion, was that a political assassination?
Let Chris take this one.
I would like, look, it happened, what, on the 10th? I would like to give the police another week. Part of the problem with this country is the vacuum in information. You would think with something like this, you'd get a bulletin. But because we don't have independent policing, Rohi has to approve any statement, apparently. He had to tell them to do a professional and thorough investigation into
the president.
The president? I mean, that's unbelievable. It's hard to believe when you take all the factors into account. It's almost impossible that this was not a politically motivated assassination. We don't know who the authors are as yet. We don't know who are the people who pulled the trigger there. Obviously, a car or maybe two cars. I don't know. Was it one or two, Nigel?
Depends on who. You remember all this information is coming from the police.
Yeah. And you know, it's a community that's fairly close. There's not many exit points. You would think that they have far more information than they're letting on. And the fact that they're dealing with that information in such a secretive manner and going after somebody who lives in Arizona only adds to this speculation.
Yeah.
One hears the threats have been issued, one hears names are being called, and I would hope if we are hearing those names, then surely the police are doing the same. Now, have they gone after these people? Have they gone after the political names that are being called? We don't know. But before, I would also like to, I keep holding civil society responsible. I would have thought they would have done much, much more. The various bar associations. You have women lawyers. You have the Ghana Bar Association. You have so many civil society organizations. Yes, the Human Rights Association has certainly.
I told you you're an optimist. You've got to be an optimist.
It's going to get better, Nigel. You watch it. It's going to get better.
No, go ahead. You tell us your problem with civil society.
Well, they are rather quiet. They are rather quiet. And
when did they ever sing loudly?
You have to ask yourself, are they now victims of that killing that they have decided, look, if a person who was as openly critical and visible, could end that way, what about me? And therefore, because that could have been part of the motive to shut everybody else up. Silence.
All right. We will have to perhaps wrap up at this point because it's program time for us. But we must end the program with a word of on Courtney Crumwing, who has been murdered the past week on the streets, urging persons to vote. His murder is a reminder of how endangered political activists have become in Guyana. It is what our independence has came to be. I mean, that's what the signal is showing. The question is this what our independence has really come to be? Is it what Cuffy and Damon and Kwame and Burnham and all those who have fought for, including Dr. Rodney and Jane Phillips Gay, and other Guyanese women and men who would have been involved in the struggle over years? Political murders, like the murder of, is an affront to human decency and pursuit of nationhood. Courtney Cumming had emerged as an indigenous voice for New Guyana, emerging not from a political party. He represented a new type of political activism, prepared to use his whole body as an example of righteous resistance. Alas, he was taken down. Of course, we think it's too soon. The Coffee to 50 committee does not point fingers, but want to draw attention to the political atmosphere that makes it easy for us to make Courtney Cummings shooting a symbol to reflect on. Our politicians, especially those who man the ship of state, cannot escape responsibility for this kind of violence. We have become politically rude, crude, and lewd, and never before. What passes political discourse in high levels is danger to our common collective well-being. The Coffee to 50 committee joined the rest of the country to pay tribute to this soldier for justice. This African son, whose foreparents were dragged here to this land in chains, he did not die with chains around his feet, but was murdered. But he was murdered. His murder echoes signs of the plantation old. To his sorrowing relatives, we thank you for giving him to Guyana and to us in our struggle. It is up to us, all of us, to ensure that the life and examples lived by Courtney does not go in vain. In his memory, we urge all silent voices to open their mouths for justice, for a better Guyana. Political barbarism thrives in moments of silence and retreat. I'd like to thank the two presenters, Mr. Nigel Hughes and Mr. Christopher Ram, for being on the program this evening, and to you, our viewership. But before I go, yes.
If I may just quickly say, the Working People's Alliance will be tomorrow issuing a special edition of the Day Clean. It will be on the streets. It will, persons can get it from the Queen's Song office of the WPA. We'll be also posting it up on the website. Importantly, if you, the viewers, wish to make a contribution to the education of the three daughters of Courtney Cromie-Wing, you may do so at any branch of Republic Bank Guyana Limited. The account name is Education Fund, Daughters of Courtney Cromie-Wing, and the account number is 261-548-2. I repeat, 261-548-2 at the Republic Bank Guyana Limited. Thank you.
All right, we thank you, viewers, for staying with us. Please remember to like our page, Coffee to 50, or YouTube, Coffee to 50, and we would like to hear from you, so please send us your emails or donate to the cause, Coffee to 50 to gmail at gy@gmail.com. This has been an African Drums television organ of the Coffee to 50 Committee, an organization dedicated to empowering African Guyanese communities through education and the encouragement